In the year 1847, on the drought-cracked llano of the Mexican interior, a grieving widower was about to trade his one milk cow for a scorned bondwoman everyone mocked for her size. And before this story is done, you will hear how that bargain saved two children who had already begun to fade in their own house. Stay with me, because the price he paid was terrible. The woman he brought home was feared and insulted, and by the end of it, an entire village would be forced to look at them differently. The holding was small, hardly more than a stubborn scrape of earth north of San Jacinto de las Flores. People called it El Porvenir, though there was little future in it that season. 1.5 hectares of stone, thistle, and tired corn. The milpa had yielded only 1/3 of what it should. Wind slipped through the cane roof and shook dust into the cooking place. The well was deeper now, thanks to compadre Abundio, but water alone could not mend childbed grief, and it could not quiet a hungry infant. Fidencio Renteria was 32, broad in the shoulder, hollow in the face, and 40 days into the kind of mourning that makes a man move as if the world had been loaded onto his back. His wife, Prisca, had died after bringing their son into the world. Since then, the baby Nicasio had lived on spoonfuls and prayers. He rooted blindly at cloth that held no milk. He cried until his voice turned thin, then only whimpered. His sister Serafina, 4 years old and solemn beyond her age, asked the same question every dawn, her small bare feet white with dust on the floor. "Papa, where did Mama go?" He never answered the same way twice. Some mornings he said, "To God." Some mornings, "To rest." But that morning he only stood beside the coals, smelling old ash, sour milk, and damp earth, with no words left in him at all. Outside, Lucera shifted in the corral and gave a low, patient moo. She was the last good thing he owned. And before the sun went down, Abundio would arrive with news from Silao that would make that cow look less like wealth and more like a choice. If you want to stay with stories like this, subscribe and keep listening. Abundio came in the late afternoon, with road dust on his leggings and the smell of mule sweat still on him. He stood at the doorway, turning his hat in both hands, glancing once at the baby, once at Lucera in the corral, and once at Fidencio, as if the order of those 3 things mattered. Serafina was squatting near the hearth, drawing crooked little houses in the dirt with a stick. Nicasio lay in a crate padded with folded cloth, his face pinched and yellowish from hunger. When he cried now, it came in weak pulls, like a bird caught under a basket. Abundio heard it, and the look on his face changed. "I went as far as Silao," he said at last. "There was market day. Salt, hides, mules, iron pots, and something else." Fidencio did not ask him to sit. There was only one stool with a whole leg anyway. He stood by the table, rough fingers pressed against the wood. "Say it plain." Abundio lowered his voice, though there was no one there but the children. He said he had seen a notice fixed to a post near the municipal house. Black captives brought inland from Veracruz. Men looking for labor bought them quietly, kept them quietly, and called the thing some other name when it suited them. Among them, people were talking about a woman, a large one, broad as a grain chest, mocked by the idlers, yet known for helping with births, tending infants, and keeping a kitchen alive where others would let it die. The room seemed to tighten around that one piece of news. From outside came the sound of Lucera cropping at the dry weeds, calm, steady, innocent. Fidencio looked toward the corral and said nothing for so long that Abundio shifted his weight. "They say the foreman handling them is Porfirio Alcantara," he added. "And they say he wants one good milk cow for that woman." At that, Serafina lifted her head. "Papa," she asked softly, "if the cow goes away, what will the baby drink?" Fidencio closed his eyes for a moment. Then he opened them, looked at Abundio, and asked the one question he had been fighting since the man stepped through the door. Did you see her with your own eyes? Abundio nodded once. I saw her. He came farther into the room then, lowering himself onto the edge of the broken stool as if the news had weight of its own. He said the market in Silao was loud, with the usual noise first. Pigs squealing, mule harness ringing, men arguing over beans and leather. But near the municipal house there was a different little crowd. The ugly kind. The kind that laughs with its mouth and measures with its eyes. A paper had been nailed to a post. He could not read all of it, but others read it aloud. Strong black workers from Veracruz. Good for labor, good for kitchens, good for children, good for whatever a buyer needed and could pay for. Fidencio listened with both hands braced on the table. Abundio swallowed. There were 2 young fellows there too, wrist to wrist in iron, thin as fence poles. And beside them, that woman. Big in the shoulders, big in the hips, standing straight while the fools around her smirked. She was wearing a faded blue wrap and a headcloth. One man said she had helped deliver babies on a coastal estate. Another said she could quiet a fevered child faster than any village ant. They were talking about her as if she were a mule with special training. The smell of ashes had gone cold in the hearth. Serafina had stopped scratching in the dirt. Even Nicasio seemed to listen between weak breaths. Who was selling them? Fidencio asked. Porfirio Alcantara. Thick mustache, boots too fine for honest work. Abundio rubbed his palm over his knee. And there was another man hanging around him, a passing trader called Casiano Robledo. He was the one jeering the loudest, saying nobody wanted the broad one unless they needed a wet nurse who could swing an axe. Fidencio's jaw tightened so hard it showed in his cheeks. Abundio looked toward the corral again. I asked the price twice to be sure. Alcantara said 1 sound milk cow. Robledo laughed and said for a woman like that, the buyer would be getting more than flesh. He'd be buying the chance to keep a house from falling apart. That night, after Abundio left and the dark settled heavy over the yard, Fidencio stood by Lucera's stall with his forehead against her warm neck. From inside the house came a thin, breaking cry that made the choice feel nearer than dawn. He stayed there a long while, one hand buried in Lucera's coarse hide, feeling the slow warmth of her breathing under his palm. The corral smelled of dung, dry grass, and the faint sweetness of milk. Above him the night had opened wide and hard, full of cold stars. Inside the house, Nicasio's crying came and went in weak bursts. Each sound reached him like a tug on a rope. When he finally went back in, the fire had dropped to red crumbs. Serafina was asleep on a reed mat with her cheek on one arm, her little fist still closed around the stick she had been drawing with. Fidencio lifted the baby, and the child weighed almost nothing. That frightened him more than the crying. A newborn should feel rooted to the earth. This one felt as if a strong wind might carry him off. He sat on the threshold with the boy in his arms and looked into the dark where the path went down toward the village. In the first days after Prisca died, old Doña Cuca had climbed that path with tortillas wrapped in cloth and a clay cup of atole, muttering that sorrow was a poor cook and children could not eat mourning. She had done what she could. So had Abundio with the well. But you know how it is in poor country. Kindness arrives by handfuls, while need comes with a shovel. Near midnight, he laid the child back down and reached for the cedar box where Prisca kept her sewing things. Her scent had almost left it by then. Almost. He found a length of blue thread, 2 bone buttons, and the strip of linen she had folded for the baby before her fever took her mind away from this world. He pressed that cloth to his mouth, shut his eyes, and spoke to her in the low voice a man uses when he has no witness but God and the dead. I do not know if this is sin or mercy, he whispered. But if I go, if I make that trade, I swear on your name I will never put iron on that woman. I will never raise my hand to her. At first light, before Serafina woke and before he could change his mind, He took down the rope hanging by the door and walked toward the corral. Lucera turned her head as he entered. From the road below came the creak of cartwheels. Someone was arriving early. It was Doña Cuca who came up the road in that creaking cart, wrapped in a gray rebozo, with a clay pot tucked between her knees and a bundle of fresh tortillas under a cloth. Her mule snorted steam into the morning chill. She saw the rope in Fidencio's hand, saw Lucera waiting at the rail, and she did not waste time asking foolish questions. "So," she said, climbing down with care, "the road has chosen you before breakfast." He took the pot from her. Warm atole, thick and sweet with piloncillo. The smell rose with the steam and stirred Serafina from sleep inside. Doña Cuca stepped into the house, crossed herself toward the little shelf where Prisca's image card still leaned, and looked at the baby. She touched Nicasio's cheek with 2 fingers, dry and light as twigs. "He's going empty," she murmured. "You know that." Fidencio nodded. He had reached the place where pride had no room left in him. He told her in a few hard words what Abundio had brought from Silao. A woman for a cow. A woman mocked for her body. A woman said to know milk, births, kitchens, fever, and all the stubborn work that keeps children on this side of the grave. Doña Cuca listened without flinching. "In this world," she said, "good help often arrives wearing shame somebody else gave it." She handed Serafina a torn piece of tortilla and told her to eat slowly. Then she turned back to Fidencio. "If you go before the sun climbs. Men like Alcantara grow meaner when a crowd gathers. And if that woman comes back with you, hear me now. Don't bring another sorrow into this house by treating her like the beasts in a drove." His face changed at that, just slightly. "I swore already," he said, "by Prisca." Doña Cuca held his gaze and seemed to measure whether the oath would hold. Then she reached into her apron and pressed 3 small silver coins into his hand. "For salt, or for the road, or for courage. I don't care which." A little later, with Serafina crying quietly into the old woman's skirt and Nicasio wrapped against the morning air for the journey, Fidencio led Lucera onto the path toward Silao. By the time the church bell in the village struck ties, he could already hear the market ahead, and another sound with it, metal knocking against metal. The market sound grew thicker with every step down the lane. By the time Fidencio reached the first row of stalls, the air was full of dust, chile, mule dung, hot tallow, and men's voices crossing over one another like knives. Lucera walked beside him with her steady cow's patience, her rope damp in his hand. Nicasio slept against his chest in a sling made from an old shawl, his breath weak and warm through the cloth. He passed heaps of squash, strings of dried peppers, iron tools laid on blankets, and women selling cheese from shaded corners. None of it touched him. He moved through that bustle as if he were deaf to everything but the thin sound the baby had made before sleep took him. A few men glanced at the cow and nodded the way traders do when they spot something sound. One even called out a price. Fidencio kept walking. Near the municipal house, he saw the knot of people Abundio had spoken of. It was an ugly kind of crowd, half curious and half amused. Boys craned their necks. 2 men stood grinning with pulque on their breath. There, in a patch of hammered sun, stood the pair in irons Abundio had described. Young, hollow-cheeked, wrists fastened together with a short chain that clinked whenever one shifted his weight. Their eyes stayed low. Beside them was Porfirio Alcantara, broad in the belly, his mustache waxed into points, boots polished bright as if shine could make a brute look lawful. Then Fidencio saw her. She was seated on an upturned crate, a few paces apart from the chained men, as if even in disgrace she had been set in a category of her own. Large, yes. Broad through the middle, heavy in the arms and shoulders. A faded blue skirt, a yellow cloth tied over her hair. Her hands rested on her knees, still and strong. Men had mocked her, that much was plain from the snickering around her. Yet she sat with a kind of quietly earned dignity, that made the mockery look cheap. Alcantara noticed the cow first. His face changed at once. "Well now," he said, stepping forward, "that one came ready to do business." The woman on the crate lifted her head and looked straight at Fidencio. For a moment, the whole market seemed to narrow to that look. She did not lower her eyes, she did not smile, and she did not beg. There was dust on the hem of her skirt, a faint sheen of sweat at her temples, and a steadiness in her face that sat oddly among all that noise and cruelty. Fidencio had seen shame before. He had seen it in men beaten by debt, in widows asking for grain, in children wearing hunger on their bones. What he saw in her was something else. Weariness, perhaps. Anger, certainly. But not surrender. Porfirio Alcantara snapped his fingers toward Lucera as if the matter were already settled. "Fine animal," he said. "Good udder, sound legs. You've brought the right price." Fidencio kept his hand on the rope. "I came to ask first." A few men nearby chuckled. One of them, red-cheeked and sour with drink, muttered, "Ask the woman if she can cook enough for her own appetite." Another laughed through his nose. The seated woman did not turn toward them. She stayed fixed on Fidencio, waiting to hear what kind of man he was when other men were mocking somebody weaker in law than themselves. He asked the first thing that mattered. "Do you know how to feed a child who has lost his mother?" The laughter thinned. Alcantara rolled one shoulder as if the question bored him. "She knows whatever I say she knows. She came from Veracruz stock, worked in a house, worked in fields, worked wherever told." But Fidencio was not looking at him. At last the woman answered in a low, even voice. "I know babies. I know birthing. I know broths, gruels, herbs for the belly, cloths for fever, and how to keep flies off milk." She paused, and her eyes moved to the sling against his chest.
"How old is the child? 40 days?"
Her face changed then, only a little. "And the mother?" "Gone." A dry wind crossed the square. Somewhere behind them a mule kicked a trough. The woman drew one slow breath. "Then he needs more than cow's milk and luck." Fidencio swallowed. "And land work? Roof patching? Firewood? Kitchen?" She gave the smallest nod. "My mother taught me all of it near Alvarado." Alcantara stepped in again, smiling with impatience. "Her name is Balbina. Ask what you want. But if you mean to bargain, do it now." Then Fidencio spoke the vow he had carried all morning, in front of God, the crowd, and the woman herself. His voice came out rough from disuse. "My wife died bringing that child into the world," he said. "I have a little girl at home, and land that is failing. If you come with me, you will work, and you will eat from the same fire as my children. Hear me well. By the soul of Prisca, I will not chain you, and I will not strike you. Not with my hand, not with rope, not with any lie." That stirred the crowd more than if he had shouted. One man snorted. Another spat into the dust. Alcantara gave a short laugh, the kind men use when something honorable inconveniences them. "You speak as if you're wedding her," he said. "She is a purchase, nothing more. A strong one, I grant you. Good for hauling, good for kitchens, good for whatever breaks in a poor man's yard." Balbina did not look at him. Her eyes stayed on Fidencio, measuring. He could feel the market pressing around them, waiting to see whether he would shame himself, or her, or both. Nicasio stirred in the sling and gave a dry little cry. At that sound, the woman's face shifted faster than it had for any words spoken there. "How long since the mother died?" she asked. 40 days. "And what does he take now?" "Cow's milk, when he keeps it down. Thin broth sometimes." She frowned, thinking, not pitying.
He needs smaller feedings. Warm, not hot. Often. Clean cloth. Shade from flies.
Then she glanced toward Lucera.
And once that cow is gone, you will need a goat, or a neighbor with one.
Fidencio nodded once. He had already crossed too much ground inside himself to turn back. Alcantara slapped his palm against Lucera's flank and grinned. Then we are done. But Balbina spoke before hands changed rope.
I haven't said yes.
That silenced a little ring of men more thoroughly than any priest could have done. Alcantara's smile thinned. You'll go where you're sent. She rose from the crate in one steady motion, tall and broad and impossible to ignore now. Dust fell from her skirt. Then she turned fully to Fidencio and asked the only thing that mattered to her.
When your daughter looks at me, what will you tell her I am?
The question settled over them like dust after a cart passed. Fidencio did not answer quickly. He looked past Balbina for a moment, toward the church tower rising above the square, then back at her. The child in the sling stirred again, his mouth working in sleep. At last, Fidencio said, I will tell her your name. I will tell her you came to help keep her brother alive. And I will tell her that in my house, no one is spoken to like an animal. A murmur moved through the men nearby. One of them laughed once, sharp and unbelieving, then fell quiet when Fidencio did not so much as turn his head. Balbina watched him another moment. She seemed to be weighing not his poverty, which was plain, nor the child-bed grief he carried in his face, which was plainer still, but the space inside his words, where a lie would usually live. Then she gave a small nod.
My name is enough, she said. For now.
Alcantara made an impatient sound and reached for Lucera's rope. Fidencio did not let go at once. His hand tightened. The cow blinked, flicked one ear, and shifted her weight in the dust, unaware that her life had just been divided from his. He passed the rope over only when he had no strength left to delay. One milk cow bartered. That was all it took, in the eyes of the market, to move a woman from one misery to another. Casiano Robledo, the trader Abundio had mentioned, appeared from behind a stall with a grin too wide for his narrow face. There, he said, you've bought yourself a whole kitchen and half a mule's worth of muscle. He laughed at his own wit. Balbina did not look at him. Alcantara, pleased with the trade, counted out nothing, signed nothing, and only jerked his chin as if that were law enough. Fidencio shifted Nicasio higher against his chest. Can you walk? He asked her quietly. She almost smiled at that, though there was no softness in it. I have walked farther on worse days. They turned away from the market together under 100 staring eyes. Behind them, Lucera gave one low cry that reached Fidencio between the shoulders like a hand. He nearly looked back. Then Balbina said, without lifting her voice, Before we reach your place, I need to know whether any neighbor keeps goats, and whether your daughter frightens easy. They had left the last houses of Silao behind when Fidencio answered her. My girl startles at loud men, he said. Not at women, not at work. She's been too quiet since her mother died. He shifted the sling with one hand and kept walking. The road was pale with dust, the sun already climbing, the heat beginning to rise off the stones in a wavering sheet. And yes, there is an old widow near us with 2 goats. If she takes pity, we may manage. Balbina walked beside him with a long, even stride, as if she were used to measuring distance by endurance instead of hope. She asked practical things, and asked them in order. How far to the ranch? Whether the roof leaked at the center or the eaves? Whether there was clean cloth left in the house? Whether the well held through the dry months? Whether flies were bad at dusk? Fidencio answered each one, and with every answer he understood something new. She was already inside the problem, already arranging it in her mind. You boiled the milk? She asked. Sometimes. Always, she said. And the child must be fed a little at a time.
If he gulps, he'll lose it. He glanced at her then. You speak as if you've seen many such babies. I have. Her face turned toward the road ahead. Rich women's children, poor women's children, children born in storms, children born in drought, children born with no one ready for them. She paused, then added, The hungry all sound alike after a while. The words sat between them for a few steps. Near a stand of mesquite, they stopped to let the baby breathe in the shade. Fidencio loosened the cloth, and Nicasio gave a weak cry, rooting blindly again. Balbina did not touch him without asking. She simply leaned near enough to look and said, His tongue is dry. We must not waste daylight. There was care in the way she kept her voice low around the child. They walked on. By noon, the dust had worked into Fidencio's sandals, and his shoulders ached from carrying the boy. Ahead, the line of the drought-cracked llano opened toward home. In the far distance, he could already make out the squat shape of the house, and a small figure waiting by the doorway. Serafina had seen them coming. When she understood that her father was not returning alone, she did not run to greet him. She stood very still. She stayed that way until they came close enough for dust to settle around their feet. Serafina had one hand on the doorframe and the other pressed against her mouth. Her hair was loose from sleep. Her little dress was wrinkled at the hem. She looked first at her father, then at the sling where her brother lay, and only then at the woman walking beside him. Children notice the truth in the order things appear. She knew at once that something in the house had changed. Doña Cuca came out behind her, wiping her hands on her apron. The old woman took one quick look at Balbina and gave no sign of surprise beyond a small lift of the chin. So, she said, you found the road back. Then her eyes moved to the baby. And he's still breathing. Good. Bring him inside before the flies wake. Fidencio stepped toward the doorway, but Serafina did not move aside. She kept staring at the stranger's skirt, her hands, her face. Balbina stopped a pace short of her and waited. No sweet talk, no reaching, just patience. The yard smelled of hot dust, ash, and the bitter green of crushed weeds under sandals. At last, Serafina whispered, Are you staying? Balbina answered her as if the child's question deserved the same weight as any grown person's. If your father lets me work, I am. That seemed to satisfy something small but urgent in the girl. She shifted to one side. Fidencio went in at once and laid Nicasio on the pallet near the hearth. The boy began to fuss. Balbina looked around the room only once, but in that one look she took in the crooked table, the soot-thick cooking stones, the cracked jar for water, the patched blankets, the roof light leaking through 2 places above. Boil water, she said. Doña Cuca did it without offense. Fidencio obeyed too. Balbina set down the bundle she had carried from the market, rolled up her sleeves and went straight to the shelf where the cups were stacked. She chose the smallest clay one, rinsed it herself, then turned toward the old widow. You said goats, she said. If one of yours is milking, we need her now. Doña Cuca narrowed her eyes. You know how to draw milk from a nervous doe? Balbina met the question without blinking. Outside, as if summoned by the challenge, one of the old woman's goats gave a sharp, impatient bleat. Balbina answered by walking straight out into the yard. The goat stood near the low fence, stamping one thin hoof and jerking its head at the flies. White along the belly, brown across the back, nervous in the eyes. Doña Cuca folded her arms, waiting for a mistake. Serafina hovered by the doorway. Fidencio stayed beside the pallet where Nicasio fussed and swallowed dryly. He could hear the goat's sharp breath, the scrape of horn against wood, the faint rattle of loose roofing reeds in the noon wind. Balbina did not rush. She crouched as much as her heavy frame allowed, spoke low to the animal, and held out the back of her hand first. The goat sniffed, flinched, sniffed again. Balbina slid in beside her, calm as if she had all afternoon, though the baby's weak crying said otherwise. In a moment she had the pail set, the teat in hand, and milk striking clay in quick, pale streams.
Doña Cuca let out a little grunt through her nose. "Well," she said, "you weren't boasting." "I don't boast," Balbina replied. She carried the warm milk inside, strained it through a clean scrap of cloth, then set some over the fire only long enough to take the chill off. She cooled a little on her wrist, frowned, waited one heartbeat more, then took the smallest cup and a folded rag. Nicasio rooted blindly, mewling. Balbina settled on the low stool, nodded once for Fidencio to come near, and said, "Not fast. If he fights the first swallow, let him." Her hands were sure. She wet the cloth, touched it to the baby's lips, and let him taste before giving him more. The room went still except for the soft clicking of his mouth against the damp rim of the cup. Once he coughed. Fidencio's whole body tightened. Balbina adjusted the angle at once. "There," she murmured. "Again." A little milk dribbled down the baby's chin, then another swallow went in, and stayed. Even Doña Cuca stepped closer. The next swallow held too, then another. Nicasio's hands unclenched. The hard cry that had lived in the house for weeks faded into a few greedy sniffs. Balbina kept the pace small, exact, patient as a midwife timing breath. When the child finally sagged against the folded blanket, milk-drunk and quiet, Fidencio looked at him as if he had never seen silence before. Then Balbina lifted her eyes to the roof, to the walls, to the blackened hearth, and said, "Now we must speak about everything else that is trying to kill this house." What followed was plain work, and plain work can look almost holy in a house that has been losing. Balbina started with the roof. She stepped into the yard, shaded her eyes, and studied the broken thatch as if it had spoken to her. 2 places had thinned to lace. One corner sagged where old rain had rotted the binding. She asked for a ladder. There was none. So Fidencio dragged over a feed crate and a half-split log, and she climbed with a steadiness that made Serafina gasp, and Doña Cuca mutter, "That woman was built to argue with storms." By late afternoon she was back on the ground, hands full of dry reeds she had pulled from the worst patch, showing Fidencio what had to be replaced before the next hard weather. Then she moved to the water jars, the grinding stone, the hearth. She found 2 sacks in the corner, one with worm-bitten maize, and one with enough good kernels left to save. She spread them on a cloth and began sorting, quick fingers dividing shriveled grain from sound. "You plant the thin ones," she said, "and you harvest disappointment." Fidencio stood there listening, half ashamed that he had not noticed how much neglect had gathered under his own roof. Childbed grief had left him seeing only the next cry, the next cup, the next night. Everything beyond that had gone dim. Serafina, meanwhile, had begun her slow orbit around the newcomer, first from the doorway, then from the hearth, then close enough to touch the edge of Balbina's skirt and pull her hand back again. Balbina let her come at her own pace. She set dough in a bowl with a little water, a little salt, and began kneading, as if she had worked that kitchen for years. The smell of wet masa and smoke rose through the room. It was the first hopeful smell the house had known in a long time. "Can you make them round?" Serafina asked suddenly. Balbina looked down at her. "Round enough to please a hungry child." That answer earned the smallest smile from the girl. When dusk came and the first thick tortillas puffed on the hot stone, Fidencio took one bite and had to lower his eyes. Warm food, a sleeping baby, a roof already under judgment. It was too much mercy for one evening. Then Serafina, watching Balbina's hands press the dough, said the words that froze the whole room in place. "Mama." The word hung there, small and dangerous. Balbina's hands stopped over the dough. The fire gave a dry pop. Outside, one of the goats scraped at the yard with its hoof. Fidencio felt the tortilla in his hand go cold. For a heartbeat, nobody moved, because in houses marked by death, even a child's mistake can feel like someone stepping into a graveyard with muddy shoes. Serafina looked from one face to the other, sensing at once that she had touched something hidden. Then she tried again, more carefully this time. "Mama? Balbina?"
Doña Cuca lowered her head and busied herself with the pot, pretending not to listen. That was kindness. Old women know when a room must be left to the living.
Balbina wiped her palms on her skirt and knelt slowly so she was level with the child. Her knees cracked a little with the bend. "You had a mother," she said, and her voice was quiet enough that the baby kept sleeping. "No one takes her place." Serafina nodded, solemn as a little judge. "I know." Then, after a pause, she asked, "Can I call you that a little?" Fidencio had to turn his face away. It was just a tired kitchen, smoke in the rafters, masa on the board, and a little girl asking for a word soft enough to rest her grief inside. But some moments arrive without warning and still divide a life. Balbina looked at the child for a long breath. Something old and bruised crossed her face, gone almost as soon as it came. "A little," she said at last. Serafina accepted that as if a treaty had been signed. Fidencio stepped outside before the tears could show in front of them. The evening air was cooling. The smell of dust and goat hair met him in the yard. He leaned one hand on the fence and bowed his head until the rough wood pressed marks into his palm. Childbed grief had hollowed him so deeply, but even mercy hurt when it arrived. Behind him, through the open doorway, he could hear Balbina moving again. Bowl, cloth, comal, soft footsteps, house sounds, living sounds. In a village as small as theirs, living sounds never stayed private for long. The next morning, when Fidencio went down toward the spring path for kindling, two women drawing water fell silent as he approached, then looked past him toward his house with the bright, hungry eyes of people who had already begun to talk. By noon, the whisper had already made its rounds. Fidencio felt it before he heard it clearly. A pause at the spring, a lowered voice behind a hand, a glance that slid past his shoulder toward the track leading up to his place. The two women with the water jars greeted him, but not as they had before. One gave him a stiff nod. The other said, "So it's true then," and smiled the way people smile when they want news more than they want to be decent. He bent for his bundle of sticks and kept his voice level. "What is true?" "That you brought home a market woman." The younger one shifted the clay jar against her hip. "A big dark one from Silao. They say you traded your only cow." Fidencio straightened. The bark on the firewood scratched his forearm. "They say many things." "Yes," the older woman murmured. "And by Sunday they'll say more." He left before they could ask another question. When he climbed back toward the house, the sun was high and mean, and the drought-cracked llano shimmered in a pale sheet. He found Balbina in the yard with her skirt tucked up slightly, shaking old dust from blankets and laying them across the fence. Serafina followed her from task to task, carrying clothespins in both fists, as if she had been given rank. Inside, the baby slept. Real sleep, the kind that lets a house breathe. "You were right," Fidencio said. Balbina did not stop working. "About the milk?" "About the village." That brought the smallest sound from her, not quite a laugh. "A place like this can smell change before it sees it." He told her what had been said at the spring. She listened, beat a blanket once against the post, and spread it smooth. "Let them look," she said. "Looking does less harm than hunger." The words were steady, but he noticed something then. She had chosen the yard instead of the doorway. Chosen open sun over the shadow where passing eyes could not pin her so easily. She understood villages, understood what it meant to be measured before you were known. That evening, as smoke from cook fires drifted low across the fields, the church bell called for vespers. From the village below, carried thin by the wind, came another sound close behind it, the voice of Father Onorato, already beginning his sermon. The sound floated up the slope in broken pieces, carried between the mesquite and the dry grass. Fidencio could not make out every word from the yard, but he knew the shape of a sermon even when the wind tore it apart. Father Onorato had one of those thin, cutting voices that seemed made for naming sins other people had not yet confessed.
A phrase reached them clearly enough. Another followed after it. Order. Boundaries. What God set apart. Balbina was at the washstone, sleeves rolled, rubbing a shirt against the ridged surface until the water in the basin turned brown. She did not lift her head. Doña Cuca, who had stayed longer than usual, clicked her tongue softly. "He's heard something already." "He has heard gossip," Fidencio said.
The old woman gave him a look from under her brows. In a village, gossip is the first horse, and truth comes behind on foot. She gathered her shawl, called Serafina to bring in the cloths before due, and lowered her voice. "If you go to Mass on Sunday, they will stare. If you do not go, they will talk worse." Balbina wrung out the shirt and laid it over the line. "Then they may choose which trouble pleases them." That answer should have sounded hard. Instead, it sounded tired, as if she had lived too long under other people's measures to give them more of herself than that. When darkness came, they ate in a quieter mood. Nicasio woke twice, fed better, and settled faster. Serafina leaned against Balbina's side while she chewed her tortilla, as children do when they have started trusting a body before they understand why. Fidencio noticed that, and looked down at his hands. Later, when the fire had burned low and the house smelled of damp cloth, wood smoke, and fresh masa, someone knocked on the doorpost. It was Abundio. He stepped in, hat in hand, his face uneasy. "Compadre," he said, and then glanced at Balbina before he went on. "I came from the lower road." Father Honorato was speaking after prayers with Father Damaso Villanueva. They weren't saying names, but names were not needed. They are already asking what kind of man trades his cow for a woman and brings her under the same roof as his little girl. The room fell still. Then Abundio swallowed and added, "And that was before Alcántara's man was seen in the village again." Abundio's last words seemed to stay in the rafters after he stopped speaking. Fidencio set his cup down without drinking. Balbina had gone very still beside the hearth, one hand resting on the table, the other on the folded cloth she had just used for the baby. Serafina was asleep already, her head against Doña Cuca's lap, and Nicasio made a soft sound in his sleep that turned every grown voice in the room quieter at once. "What man?" Fidencio asked at last. Abundio rubbed his jaw. "I didn't see him close. One of Alcántara's sort. A narrow fellow on a sorrel mule, asking where your place lies. Asking whether the woman from market came here." He stopped first by Murillo's store, then at the blacksmith's, like a man pretending to want directions when what he really wants is to be noticed. Doña Cuca muttered a prayer under her breath. Balbina spoke then, and her voice carried no panic, only thought. "Did he say my name?" "No," Abundio answered. "Only the large one from Silao." A small bitterness passed over her face and was gone. She had heard worse, perhaps all her life. Still, the insult hung there. Fidencio rose and went to the doorway. Night had thickened over the yard. The goats shifted in their pen. Far off, the last of the sermon had died away, leaving only the rasp of crickets and the dry rustle of weeds. He stood with one hand on the post, feeling the rough grain press into his palm. "If Alcántara sent him," he said, "then he means trouble." "He means to see whether you frighten easy," Balbina replied. That was true enough to anger him. He turned back toward her. "And do you?" She met his look. "I learned long ago that fear is expensive. I spend it carefully." Abundio stood up. "I can stay the night if you want another man here." Fidencio almost said yes. But another man in the house meant more eyes, more ears, more talk tomorrow. He thanked him and refused. Doña Cuca carried Serafina to her pallet, kissed the child's forehead, and left with Abundio under the moon. When the yard finally fell quiet again, Fidencio barred the door for the first time in months. Then, from outside in the darkness, came the slow crunch of a boot on gravel. The sound came again, slow and deliberate, as if whoever stood outside wanted the house to feel each step. Fidencio lifted the latch bar halfway,
only to ready it. Balbina had already moved without noise. She took Serafina's blanket and drew it a little higher over the sleeping child. Then she stood near the hearth where the firelight did not fully reach her face. Nicasio gave one restless sigh and settled again. The whole room smelled of cooling ashes, goat milk, and damp night air leaking through the reed roof. "Who's there?" Fidencio called. A man answered from the dark. "Only a traveler, asking the road." That was a lie so poor it almost sounded like mockery. "The road sleeps at this hour," Fidencio said. "Ask it in daylight." There was a pause.
Then the man came just close enough for his outline to show through the cracks of the door. Hat brim low, narrow shoulders, one hand on a mule rein. "I was told a woman came up from Silao to this place," he said. "A large one. I was sent to make sure she arrived where she was meant to." Balbina's mouth tightened, though she said nothing. Fidencio slid the bar firmly back into place. "She arrived where I brought her." The man gave a dry little laugh. "That may not be the same thing." Outside, the mule stamped and jingled its bridle. Inside, the silence sharpened. Balbina stepped forward then, close enough that her voice carried through the wood. "And who sent you?" she asked. The man did not answer at once. When he did, he spoke toward Fidencio, not toward her. "Tell Alcantara's business only this. Papers can walk farther than a cow can. Men in Silao know whose property passes through their square." Property. The word sat foul in the room. Fidencio opened the door then, only a hand's width, enough to show his face and the old musket hanging on the wall behind him. He did not lift it. He did not need to. "You tell whoever sent you," he said, very calm, "that my house is not a corral for his visits." The rider studied him a moment, then tugged the mule around. Gravel cracked again under hoof and sandal. The sound faded down the path. Only when it was gone did Fidencio close the door fully. Behind him, Balbina spoke in a voice lower than before. "He said papers." She looked straight at Fidencio. "If Alcantara is reaching for papers, then this is not over." No one slept much after that. The house kept its silence, but it was the wrong kind, stretched tight like hide on a drum. Fidencio sat near the door with the old musket across his knees, though he knew the weapon was more memory than force. Balbina dozed only in scraps, upright in the chair by the hearth so she could hear the baby before he fully woke. Twice in the night Nicasio stirred and fed. Twice Serafina rolled over and reached in her sleep until her hand found the edge of Balbina's skirt hanging from the chair. At dawn the light came gray and thin through the roof reeds. Everything looked tired, even the walls. Fidencio stepped outside first. The yard was empty except for the goats and the churn of mule tracks in the dust below the path. Proof enough that the rider had been real and wanted them to know it. The tracks led back toward the village. He stood over them a long moment. Behind him he heard Balbina at the doorway. "My father died owing other men," she said. It was the first thing she had offered of herself without being asked. Fidencio turned. She had not yet braided her hair. The morning made her look older and younger at once. "What do you mean?" She leaned one shoulder against the post. "I mean, men like Alcantara always think a debt can be stretched until it becomes a chain. My mother fought that all her life. Some won by law, some lost by distance. Some lost because nobody around them could read what was said in front of them." That last line settled heavily between them. "You can read?" he asked. "A little more than a little," she said. He stared at her, not because he doubted her, but because each day seemed to reveal another tool hidden inside the same pair of hands. She looked away toward the east, where the road bent down to Las Animas del Monte. "If he comes with paper," she went on, "paper must be answered." Before Fidencio could reply, they heard someone calling from the lower path. It was Evaristo Murillo, the storekeeper from the village, red-faced from the climb and carrying a sack over one shoulder.
He stopped at the gate, breathing hard. "I brought salt and lard. Doña Cuca asked me to leave," he said. Then his eyes went from Fidencio to Balbina, and something like embarrassment crossed his face. "Also, there's talk in the plaza. Alcantara himself may come next time, and he won't come alone." Murillo did not stay long after saying it. He shifted the sack from one shoulder to the other, set it down by the door, and looked as if he regretted having a conscience at all. "I'm telling you because I'd rather bring salt than bad news," he said. Then his eyes slid toward Balbina and he cleared his throat. "And because the man in the plaza was saying too much, too loudly. He claimed there was debt behind her. Family debt. Old debt. The sort men like to drag out when they want a body to follow it." Balbina's face changed at that. Not fear, exactly. Recognition. "My father," she said quietly.
They will use my father.
Murillo blinked. "Then you know something of it?" "I know enough to hate the sound of it." After he left, the morning seemed to harden around the house. Even the sunlight looked sharp on the stones. Fidencio spent the next hours moving through chores he could barely feel in his hands. He patched a fence rail, he checked the goats, he fetched water. All the while his mind kept circling the same foul words. Debt, paper, property. Men had a way of using ink to do what rope could not. Balbina did not sink under the news. She worked. That was her answer to nearly everything. She washed the baby's clods, set aside better grain, sent Serafina to gather the driest sticks from under the mesquite, and once, while kneading, asked Fidencio whether anyone in the district knew letters well enough to read a formal claim if one came. "The alcalde knows some," he said. "So does the notary in the village, though I would trust him only after checking his pockets." She gave a brief, humorless breath through her nose.
That is still more than trusting Alcantara's mouth. By late afternoon, a wind began to move over the drought-cracked llano, lifting loose dirt against the walls and bringing the smell of far-off rain that never quite arrived. Serafina was feeding scraps to the goats. Nicasio had just gone down to sleep. Fidencio was at the woodpile when he heard it. Not one horse this time. Several. He straightened slowly and looked toward the lower path. 3 riders were coming up through the dust, one broad in the saddle, one thin and bent over a leather satchel, and one with a long firearm across his lap. When Balbina stepped out beside him, she did not ask who the first rider was. She already knew. The riders came on without hurry, which was its own kind of insult. Dust rose around the horses' legs and drifted across the yard in pale sheets. The first man sat thick and easy in the saddle, mustache trimmed, boots polished, belly pressing against his belt as if the whole world had been arranged for his comfort. Porfirio Alcantara did not need introducing. Behind him rode a thin fellow with a satchel of papers tied under one arm, and beside that one a guard with a long gun across his thighs, and the flat eyes of a man hired to stand where other men wished to frighten. Fidencio stepped forward before they reached the gate. He could feel Balbina at his shoulder, not hiding, not retreating. From inside the house came the faint clink of the spoon Doña Cuca had left in the basin, shifting in the wind. Serafina had been sent to the back room with the baby the moment the riders appeared. Even so, the whole place seemed to listen. Alcantara reined in and smiled down at them, as if calling on neighbors. "Good day," he said. "I have come to settle an irregular matter." "There is nothing here for you," Fidencio answered. The scribe untied his satchel and pulled out folded sheets, thick and yellow at the edges. He wetted his lips before speaking, the way men do when they enjoy the sound of authority borrowed from ink. "A claim has been lodged," he said, "regarding the woman called Balbina, who may be subject to obligations inherited through her deceased father, and therefore not free to enter private service without review." Private service. Obligations. The words were dressed up, but their smell was the same. Balbina's face did not change. "Show me the claim."
The scribe looked at her as if a mule had asked for spectacles. Alcantara let out a soft laugh. "You will hear what needs hearing when we reach Silao." "No," she said. Her voice was low, but it cut cleanly through the yard. Even the horses shifted at it. The scribe frowned. "Madam, this is legal business." "And I asked to see the paper." He opened his mouth to dismiss her again. Then Balbina took one step forward, lifted her chin, and said, with a calm that made Fidencio feel the ground change under the whole scene, "I can read, so hand it to me." For one startled second, nobody in the yard moved. The guard's horse tossed its head. The scribe blinked as if he had misheard. Alcantara's smile faltered, then returned thinner than before. Dust drifted between them in the hard afternoon light, and from inside the house came the faint cry of Nicasio, waking hungry again, as if the child refused to let men with papers decide the hour of his life. "You?" the scribe said. Balbina held out her hand.
The paper. There are moments when power depends on everyone behaving as expected. She had stepped clean outside that expectation, and you could see the unease pass from one rider to the next. At last, the scribe handed down the folded sheet, reluctantly, with 2 fingers, as if the page itself might shame him. Balbina opened it carefully. Her eyes moved across the lines once, then again more slowly. Fidencio watched her face while the yard held its breath. Alcantara began to speak over her shoulder, trying to regain ground. "The matter is simple. A debt from Veracruz, carried through the family."
"It does not say that," Balbina cut in. Her voice was still quiet, but now it had iron in it. She looked up from the page. "It names a debt attached to my father and notes labor rendered by my mother. It does not bind me. It does not even state my birth correctly." The scribe reddened. "That is for officials to decide." "Good," she said, folding the paper back along its crease with great care. "Then we will go to officials."
Alcantara scowled. "You will come to Silao under my instruction."
"No," Fidencio said.
"She will go with me." The guard shifted his gun a little higher, not aiming, only reminding. Serafina had come silently to the back doorway now, big-eyed, one hand against the frame. Doña Cuca appeared behind her and pulled the child back before the men in the yard could notice. Balbina gave the paper to Fidencio, then turned to Alcantara.
"If there is a magistrate to hear this, let him hear it with witnesses."
"Which witnesses?" Alcantara sneered. By God's timing or village hunger for trouble, the answer came at once from the road below. The town mayor was climbing the path, and old Doña Cuca was not alone behind him. The answer to Alcantara's sneer came up the path in the shape of people he had not counted on. At the front was the town mayor, Cesario Fuentes, hat pushed back, breathing hard from the climb and already irritated by the sight of armed men in a poor yard. Behind him came Doña Cuca and old Tomasa de los Reyes, the midwife whose hands had brought half the district into the world. Tomasa was small, dry as a twig, and sharp in the eye. She took one look at Balbina, one look at the paper in Fidencio's hand, and said, "If this concerns a birth and a parent's death, then my ears belong in it." Cesario stepped between the horses and the gate. "Any claim goes before the magistrate in Silao," he said. "Not over a cooking fire, and not with a long gun for argument." Alcantara bristled, but he had pushed as far as swagger could carry him. By sunset, it was settled. They would go to Silao at first light. The scribe took back his papers. The riders withdrew with bad grace. That night, nobody in the house spoke above a murmur, as if fear itself might wake the children. They traveled before dawn in a borrowed cart, wheels creaking, breath smoking in the chill. Fidencio drove. Balbina sat beside him, straight-backed, with Tomasa and Cesario behind. The road smelled of damp earth and mule sweat. At the magistrate's office in Silao, the room was bare except for a desk, 2 chairs, and the stale odor of tobacco. Alcantara spoke first and spoke long. Then the magistrate, an old man with tired eyes, held out his hand for the paper and asked who among them had read it. "I have," Balbina said. She took the sheet and in that dim room her voice went clean and steady over every line. She read the names, the debt, the mention of her father, the labor of her mother, and then the silence where her own bondage should have been, and was not. Tomasa testified that Balbina had been born free on Mexican soil. Cesario added that no inherited debt could make property of a daughter. The magistrate listened, tapped the paper once on the desk, and said, "The claim does not bind this woman. She is free. Take this nonsense away from me." On the ride home, the light turned amber over the fields, and nobody spoke for a long while. Then Fidencio looked at Balbina and understood something that struck him harder than fear had. Now that the law had named her free, she could leave if she wished. Freedom changed the air around them, but it did not change it all at once. On the road home from Silao, Fidencio held the reins loosely and said little. The cartwheels rolled through ruts, the mule snorted, Tomasa dozed, and Cesario hummed under his breath as if the law had cost him no effort at all. Beside Fidencio, Balbina kept her hands folded in her lap. No chain had been fastened to her, yet for the first time he understood that she might still walk away from him simply by choosing another road. He waited until evening, until Serafina had eaten and Nicasio slept warm with milk in his belly, until the goats settled and the last light thinned over the yard. Then he stood with Balbina by the mended fence where the reeds cast narrow shadows on the ground. "I brought you here out of desperation," he said. "That is the truth, and I won't varnish it. But if you leave now, you will take more than labor with you." He swallowed once. "This house learned your step. My children did. I did. Stay because you want to, and if wanting can grow any larger than that, stay as my wife." She did not answer quickly. A night bird called from the mesquite. Inside the house, Serafina laughed in her sleep at some small dream. At last, Balbina looked toward the doorway where the child had begun, without asking permission anymore, to rest against her skirts, as if that place had been made for her. "I have spent my life being sent," she said. "I would like, once, to remain where I am wanted." Then she turned back to him. "Yes. They married on a cold Saturday under a hard blue sky. Not everyone came. Enough did. Cesario stood witness. Tomasa cried openly. Even Murillo brought sugar wrapped in paper. Father Honorato performed the rite with a face like vinegar, but he performed it. Serafina held Balbina's hand so fiercely all the way to the church door that her knuckles went white. And when the vows were done, the girl looked up and said, plain as sunlight, "Mother, can we go home now?" That night, there was stew in the pot, music scraped from an old guitar, and children running around the yard until sleep caught them where they stood. The roof still leaked in one corner when the weather turned. The land stayed stingy. Corn still had to be coaxed from the ground like a confession. But the gate no longer opened onto a dying place. It opened onto smoke from supper, patched reeds holding fast, and two little shirts drying side by side on a line. By morning, a pair of tiny sandals had been left outside Balbina's door, heel to heel, as if they had always belonged there. If this story stayed with you, you can subscribe and return for the next one when you're ready.